we'll get started with Diesen, who is a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway and an editor, the Russia in Global Affairs Journal. You can follow him on Twitter, of course, at Glenn Diesen. That's Glenn with two N's and Diesen, IE. So Glenn, thank you so much for joining us. You can get started with your presentation.
Thank you so much. So, yes, I was asked to speak a bit about some work I've been doing lately on think tanks and how they are, I guess, corrupted a lot of the knowledge and about, well, how knowledge itself is produced, and then especially focusing on how this think tank industry has influenced American policies towards Russia. So my main argument has been that think tanks has a tendency to corrupt knowledge itself, as the making or the production of knowledge decided to some extent by market forces, which is again the unfettered markets at its extremes. So, so I wouldn't say that think tanks would inherently be bad, merely I would say corrupted. Traditionally, I think think tanks has been can be considered a bridge between academia and decision makers. That's how it started and was intended. So while academics tend to be very focused on development of theories, how methods are developed, often they tend to be very specifically focused on single topics, and it's not always that easy to have this cooperation with decision makers. And I think decision makers have a need for expert opinions, simply because as the world grew increasingly complex over the past 100 years, especially, politicians needed effectively to make decisions on everything from fiscal policies, foreign policies, towards everything from Argentina to Ethiopia. So it's they're expected to know a lot of information. Also in the United States, this is happening at a time when one gets the impression that politicians actually sometimes know less, and a lot of their time is actually spent on campaigning for funds. So I think this is the problem. There was a need for this to have these think tanks, again, bridging academia and decision makers, originating from a reasonable purpose. However, I think when they grew in influence, the main problem is that they increasingly began to inform presidential administration. They inform Congress with policy papers. They also begin to dominate in terms of providing expert opinions to the media. They also even hire former officials who are currently out of office, almost functioning as a waiting room. And over the years, these think tanks become more and more influential. And keep in mind, this is happening at a time when academics might be losing ground, and also print media is losing its influence as well. Meanwhile, you have this increasingly well-funded, powerful think tanks capable of producing knowledge. And if the story ended there, it could be seen as they were filling a gap. But again, if you control the production of knowledge, there's an immense power. So this is the people, again, providing information to politicians, to the media, to shape it, also not just the politicians' opinions, but also the public's opinion. So this can reach a level when, to an extent, doesn't matter who's elected if you can actually control the information they act upon. And so as these think tanks became more and more powerful, we also see that they became more and more politicized. So you have the ones on the left, you have the ones on the right. So to a large extent, the conclusions which these research centers have to investigate, they already kind of have the conclusions they want. And often some of the task is to get information to support these conclusions. And again, as these think tanks gain more and more power and influence, it begs the question, who would like to fund a think tank? Who has economic interests? When it comes to domestic policy is one thing, but if we look at foreign policy, who has economic interest in influencing foreign policy by controlling the production of knowledge? Well, I guess, obviously the arms industry would be the key candidate. And as we see, this is the one who's dominating the funding of virtually all the think tanks, very much funded by the arms industry. And again, this is what Eisenhower was warning about in 61 as well in his farewell speech about the military industrial complex. He had actually first referred to it in his note as the military industrial congressional complex, but allegedly to avoid alienating Congress, he left out the congressional part. But this is, of course, I think a mistake because this is think tanks show then how they become a key institution for how the arms industry can obtain political influence. Now, I've often seen in media and interviews that this is almost a conspiracy theory to suggest that immense, huge industry would somehow pursue their own business interests by looking for military solutions to foreign policy questions. And I think, again, it becomes absurd because I think what we've seen, for example, in the United States, when war tends to become the solutions to all problems, the first solution instead of the last, it's often when one can trace back the information the influence to these think tanks. And for example, during the Ukraine war, look at the media who gets their advice from the think tanks. Virtually in all instances, they are always for more weapons, no negotiations. So there's a clear correlation between the knowledge or information or policy papers produced by think tanks and the interest of the ones who fund them. Again, it should be common sense. And this is the problem when you put foreign policy for sale effectively by market forces. So the ones who produce your knowledge can now effectively buy that knowledge. And it used to be more stealthy, but even leading figures within the think tank industries, which have been critical of this development, recognize that the think tanks these days, they don't even bother to uphold the solution of providing objective analysis. And same the politicians as well as often in the media, there's a preference often for these think tankers who can provide this easy narratives, often cliches about these struggles between good versus evil, as opposed to the complexities which we often get from the academics. Also, the think tanks can be conceptualized as excellent propaganda industry to some extent as well, because what we learn from propaganda is source credibility is key. That is, it's not what information you communicate, but it's also who communicates it. So the fact that all of this information, which is being fed to the media, fed to politicians, Congress, it all comes from this presented almost as independent institutions, academic institutions. It helps to make it seem as if this is not just marketing, but that it's actually suggesting that has actually some independent academic approach towards developing knowledge. And this over time, there has been huge recognition in media as well, how these think tanks have acquired a lot of influence. So, for example, when Obama was elected, he promised he wanted to end the Iraq War. But again, a lot of people also recognize that the CNAS, or the Center for a New American Century, had a central role in his administration. It became like the Obama's foreign policy think tank, and as the New Yorker also recognized that due to the huge influence of CNAS in the Obama administration, was quite instrumental in order for him to effectively walk back a lot of the election promises. And again, my main focus is how these think tanks are not just corrupting U.S. foreign policy by manipulating information, but also how they specifically influence policies towards Russia. Because we have to remember that the Cold War gave birth to this military industrial complex. It's also the setting in which a lot of these think tanks came up. So this was a big business. And towards the end of the Cold War, even George Kennan, he noted, actually it's a quote, he wrote that, were the Soviet Union to sink tomorrow under the waters of the ocean, the American military-industrial complex would have to go on substantially unchanged until some other adversary could be invented. Anything else would be an acceptable shock to the American economy, because too much of the economy had been built up under the military-industrial complex, and this had been connected to intrinsically into the political system. And of course, if you want to revamp or bring back militarization, who better than Russia, as this has been a key boogeyman over the years. Of course, the global war on terror, it had its day in the sun, but even the decision to expand NATO. In the 90s, I think there was more honest reporting about this, but in the 90s, from the New York Times to Washington Post, there were many reports how NATO expansion will become a bonanza for the military-industrial complex by increasing demand for American military hardware. And we see, in terms of the current conflict, for example, in Ukraine, we see how organizations such as Rand Corporation have produced these reports defined specifically how to weaken Russia by extending it. They have this chapter by chapter, how can we bleed the Russians? How can we destabilize Russia? How can we make them, promise NATO expansion, give weapons? How can this draw in the Russians so we can bleed them? How can we destabilize Belarus? How can we destabilize Central Asia? How about the Caucasus with Azerbaijan, Armenia, and essentially across the board, Syria obviously also coming in. And it's actually interesting because Rand is probably one of the most central of the think tanks. And for those who watched Stanley Kubrick's movie, Dr. Strangelove, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, that's actually a satire based on the Rand Corporation. And, he has a quote, I forgot exactly what it was, but something along, it was supposed to be a satire, but this is very close to reality. It's almost a documentary how these people think. Again, this is the business of war, when that is your business model. And this is also the problem for the think tanks. They made this into a business model. They sell foreign policy, the influence of foreign policy. And the main donor, again, will always be the weapons industry. And a lot of interesting work has been done on this. We also saw during the Russiagate era, when really the hostility towards Russia really began to intensify in the United States. We saw the Brookings Institute, for example. This is where Victoria Nuland has come from, who had a central role in toppling the government in Ukraine in 2014, and continues to have a key role. Also from the Brookings Institute, one of the primary researchers of the Steele dossier, the ones who launched this whole thing, was Danchenko, was also from the Brookings Institute, Brookings Institution. In Britain also, also not immune to this. When we have this crazy reports coming out that, out of the 150,000 Russians living in London, about half of them, 75,000 of them, were supposedly Russian spies. I mean, really insane stuff. This was, from the Henry Jackson Institute. For those who remember the Integrity Initiative from the Institute of Statecraft, also, looked at how it was another pro-democracy think tank, it was called, but again, it was funded by, government intelligence agencies. It ended up setting up these cluster groups to use, the journalists they trust, academics, researchers, lobbyists, think tanks, all of them putting them together in order to make fake narratives and essentially create false, fake knowledge, if you will. And so last example, as I think I'm running out of time, is this ISW, which during this war now in Ukraine, the main think tank that everyone goes to cite what's happening in Ukraine, all the media goes to this same think tank. It just happens, it's treated as this legitimate institution, which is independent. But again, it's run by Kimberly Kagan and Frederick Kagan, which are these, neo-conservative influencers. This is Frederick Kagan is the brother of Robert Kagan, and Robert Kagan is also the husband of Victoria Nuland. Again, had a key role in the coup in 2014. So the fact that the husband of Victoria Nuland is the one owning or started this think tank, which is supposed to inform not just the Americans but the whole world about what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, the person who helped to topple the government, it's really obscene. But yet, this is how the creation of knowledge has been corrupted. Sorry, I thought I was going to do some more, but I think I run out of time, so I'll just cut it there.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.